history repeats itself. Lessons from the past.
A wedding in a small village called Cana. The year is roughly 30 AD. The party is in full swing, but behind the scenes, there is a social disaster brewing. They've run out of wine. In the ancient Near East, this wasn't just a party foul, it was a legal and social catastrophe for the groom. Then, a guest named Jesus of Nazareth steps in. He asks for 6 stone jars to be filled with water. Moments later, the master of the banquet is tasting the finest vintage of the night. Did it actually happen? Was it a miracle, a clever trick, or a deep piece of literary symbolism? Today, we are diving into the literature of the possible. We're looking at the science, the skeptics, and the ancient myths to solve the mystery of the water into wine. First, we have to look at our only primary source, the Gospel of John, chapter 2. Unlike the other Gospels, John calls this a Semeion, a sign. 6 stone jars, 20 to 30 gallons each. That's roughly 120 to 180 gallons of wine. That is roughly 750 to 1,000 bottles today. Traditional literature from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas argues this was ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. They argue Jesus bypassed the slowness of nature. Where a vine takes years to grow and grapes weeks to ferment, Jesus did it in a heartbeat. The naturalistic perspective. What might have happened? If we put aside the supernatural for a moment, what does the literature of skepticism say? Theory A, the hidden reserve. Some 19th century critics, like David Strauss, suggested Jesus' disciples simply brought a massive wedding gift of wine and staged the discovery to honor their teacher. Theory B, the concentrate theory. Could it have been ancient chemistry? There were wine cakes in the ancient world, dehydrated grape must that could be reconstituted with water. Could the jars have been spiked with a concentrate? Theory C, mass suggestion. Could the religious fervor of the moment have acted as a form of collective hypnosis? If the wine giver was charismatic enough, would water have tasted like the best wine they'd ever had? The Dionysus connection, literary rivalry. Here is where the literature gets fascinating. At the time John was writing, the most popular god of the Greco-Roman world was Dionysus, the god of wine. Legend said that at the temple of Elis, empty jars were left in a sealed room overnight and found full of wine the next morning. Scholars argue that the story of Cana was written as a polemic. It was a way for early Christians to say to the Romans, "Your God gives you wine once a year at a festival. Our Savior gives it in abundance at a local wedding. It's Jesus versus Dionysus in a battle of the vintages." Deep transformation, psychological and allegorical meanings. Beyond the literal, many scholars view this story as a profound map of the human soul. The Jungian archetype. For Carl Jung, water represents the prima materia, the raw, unformed, and unconscious part of our psyche. It is life-sustaining, but it lacks spirit or distinct character. Wine, however, is a product of human labor and divine fermentation. To Jungians, turning water into wine represents individuation, the process of taking your common raw self and transforming it into something unique, potent, and spirited. The alchemy of the soul. Alchemy literature often uses the transformation of liquids to describe spiritual enlightenment. The water is the old man, or the old way of being. The wine is the new man. The wedding itself is the alchemy wedding, the union of the ego and the divine. Social empathy as miracle. In the honor-shame culture of the first-century Mediterranean, failing to provide enough wine at your wedding was a social death sentence. It brought shame upon the bride and groom for decades. Allegorically, this story suggests that the divine enters our lives not in moments of grand worship, but in moments of quiet social desperation, transforming our shame into celebration. The molecular challenge, modern science. Let's look at the literal challenge. If this were a physical event, what exactly would happen at the molecular level? The atomic gap. Water is simple, H2O, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. Wine, however, is an incredibly complex chemical cocktail. It contains ethanol, C2H6O, glycerol, tartaric acid, and polyphenols like tannins and anthocyanins that give it color and flavor. The carbon problem. Here's the big catch. Water has no carbon. Wine is organic, meaning it is built on carbon chains. For Jesus to turn water into wine, he would have to perform subatomic transmutation. He would have to take the nuclei of oxygen or hydrogen and somehow force them to fuse or decay into carbon atoms. The energy crisis. In our current understanding of physics, nuclear transmutation requires immense energy, the kind found inside a star or a particle accelerator. To do this silently in a stone jar would require a mastery over the strong nuclear force that holds atoms together. The biological bypass. Furthermore, wine contains imprints of time. It contains the esters created by yeast during fermentation and the tannins from grape skins. A literal miracle doesn't just change the atoms, it creates synthetic history, making a liquid that tastes like it spent months in a barrel, despite being created in a second. Conclusion. The glass is half full. Whether you see Cana as a historical fact, a literary jab at Roman gods, or a beautiful metaphor for human transformation, one thing is certain. This story has aged like a fine wine. It tells us that in the face of scarcity, there is a possibility of abundance. It tells us that the common water of our lives has the potential to become something choice. What do you think? Was it a miracle, a myth, or a misunderstanding? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries. Cheers.